By the last week of August, Mara Cole's old Ford F-350 had become a familiar sight on County Road 14. The truck would appear out of the heat shimmer just after noon, its faded blue hood trembling over the washboard road, a flatbed trailer bucking behind it beneath another load of wrought iron gates. Some still carried decorative curls from long demolished estates. Others were nothing more than warped black rectangles with missing hinges and rust bleeding through their paint. Every time the trailer hit a rut, iron clanged against iron hard enough to send meadowlarks out of the roadside sage. On Mara's first trip, people had stared. By the 6th, they had started slowing down. By the 12th, they were waiting for her. A white Dodge sat outside the feed store one afternoon while Mara fueled across the road. 2 ranchers leaned against the bed, their paper coffee cups untouched, watching her strap down another stack of twisted gates. One of them counted the load with a finger, then looked toward the other and smiled. When Mara pulled away, both men were still standing there, their faces turned after her in the dust. She kept driving. At Cole Ranch, the gates were beginning to swallow the yard. They leaned against the barn in rows. They covered the gravel beside the machine shed. They lay flat near the cattle pens, their scrollwork collecting wind-blown tumbleweed. Rust flakes stained Mara's gloves orange whenever she handled them. 800 gates in all. 800 pieces of abandoned iron on a ranch that was running out of almost everything else. The hay shed held only a few crooked stacks of bales. The hydraulic line beneath the old Massey Ferguson tractor wept dark fluid onto a piece of cardboard Mara changed every few days. One corner of the machine shed roof lifted whenever the west wind hit it hard, making a hollow metallic knock that carried into the house at night. The stock pond had retreated from its banks until cattle had to cross 20 feet of cracked mud to reach water. And beyond the barn, the south pasture looked as though someone had taken the color out of it. Western wheatgrass that had once brushed the fetlocks of her father's horses now broke beneath Mara's boots with a dry snap. Between the plants, gray soil showed through in widening patches, and when the afternoon wind came down from the west, it lifted that soil in thin curtains and dragged it toward the county road. That was where Mara hauled the gates. Not to the yard, not to the road, out into the dying pasture. She set the first ones upright near the western slope, driving T-posts into ground so hard that the steel rang beneath the hammer. She did not connect the gates end to end. Instead, she left gaps between them, then started another row farther downhill at a different angle. 3 days later, another line appeared near a shallow draw. A week after that, rusted gates stood across 2 ridges and along the edge of an eroding wash. From County Road 14, none of it looked like fencing. There were openings everywhere. Some rows ended in bare ground. Others ran diagonally across terrain. Cattle could simply walk around. Anyone who knew ranching could see that Mara was not building a corral. What they could not see was what she was building instead. The pickup trucks began slowing again. One Sunday morning, 3 vehicles stopped almost bumper to bumper outside the south fence. No one came through the gate. They simply sat there long enough for Mara, working half a mile away, to notice sunlight flashing off their windshields. A few minutes later, they drove on. That afternoon, at the diner in town, Mara entered with dust on her jeans and a smear of grease along one wrist. A table near the window went quiet when she passed. One man moved his hat off the empty chair beside him, not to make room, but to clear his view of the road toward Cole Ranch. Another man, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, traced a square in the condensation on his water glass with one finger. Then he tipped the imaginary square sideways, a small pantomime of a fence falling over. The men at the table smiled. Mara carried her coffee to the counter and opened her notebook. She did not look back. 8 months earlier, she had been sitting at her kitchen table in the middle of the night with that same notebook closed beside her. The table had belonged to her grandmother first. Her father had sanded and refinished it when Mara was 12, leaving one deep gouge near the edge because he said some marks were supposed to stay. That gouge was beneath Mara's thumb as she studied the bank statement. $138,000. The number looked too clean on paper. Nothing about the debt itself felt clean. It was hay purchased during drought, diesel burned through calving season, veterinary bills, a replacement pump for the well, parts for machines too old to justify new parts, and medical costs from the final 2 years of Daniel Cole's life. Mara's father had died in February. For months before that, he had moved more slowly through the ranch, resting one hand against fence posts when he thought she was not watching. By Christmas, Mara had been doing most of the feeding herself. By January, Daniel could no longer climb into the tractor without stopping halfway up the steps. He still kept his boots by the kitchen door. After the funeral, Mara could not bring herself to move them. Mud had dried across the soles in the shape of the last pasture he had walked. Every morning, she stepped around those boots on her way outside. The bank had given her until the next summer review to prove Cole Ranch could still support itself. There had been no threats, no dramatic confrontation, only spreadsheets, projected feed costs, cattle weights, pasture estimates, the slow movement of a banker's pen down a page. When Mara left the meeting, a folder sat on the passenger seat beside her. Inside was a map showing the southern 160 acres outlined in yellow. Selling that parcel would erase a large part of the debt. For almost anyone looking at the ranch from the outside, it was the sensible choice. Mara drove directly there. She parked beneath an old cottonwood beside the draw and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. The tree leaned slightly east, shaped by decades of prevailing wind. Halfway up its trunk was a dark scar where an 11-year-old Mara had once hammered in a nail while helping her grandfather hang a mineral sign. Earl Cole had watched her strike the nail crooked, then made her pull it out and try again until she could hit it square. Farther up the draw, the remains of a fence post still carried 2 strands of wire her father had stretched during a March blizzard. Mara remembered that day more clearly than she remembered the funeral. She had been 9. Snow had stung her face sideways while Daniel worked with bare fingers because his gloves had become too stiff with ice. Mara had followed behind him wearing one of his old coats, filling its oversized pockets with fencing staples. Every few yards, Daniel reached back without looking. Mara placed a staple in his palm, then he drove it in. That was how they had worked. No speeches, no lessons announced aloud, just a hand reaching back. A child learning when to have the next staple ready. Sitting beneath the cottonwood years later, Mara looked at the yellow bank map on the seat. Then she folded it once, then again. She placed it in the glove box and drove home. She would not sell the pasture until she had exhausted everything else. What followed was not an idea so much as a season of watching. Mara began carrying the notebook everywhere. After thunderstorms, she walked the draws and marked where brown water left the property. She pressed a steel rod into the soil, measuring how deep it penetrated before hitting hard, dry ground. She photographed grass along fence lines. She wrote down wind direction and snow depth. At first the pages seemed unrelated. A green strip behind an old corral. A patch of damp soil beside sagebrush. Deep snow caught along the county fence, while the open ridge beyond it stood nearly bare. Then the pattern became difficult to ignore. Cole Ranch received water. It simply failed to keep much of it. Summer storms came violently. Rain struck baked soil faster than it could absorb, gathered into thin streams, and ran downhill carrying the finest particles with it. After every storm, the small erosion channels were a little deeper. Winter was equally wasteful. Snow could cover the ranch with 6 inches at dusk and be gone from the exposed ridges 2 days later. Wyoming wind lifted it in white sheets, carrying it toward roadside ditches, gullies, and fence corners. Mara began thinking less about how much water fell on the ranch and more about how quickly it escaped. The answer was waiting in her father's workshop. One night, searching for a wrench, she opened a cabinet behind the drill press and found an old leather notebook wedged between 2 machinery manuals. She recognized Earl Cole's handwriting before she saw his name. Her grandfather's letters leaned sharply forward, as if they too were fighting the western wind. Most of the pages contained cattle records, vaccination dates, and notes about machinery. But toward the back, Mara found several sketches copied from old Soil Conservation Service meetings: snow fences, wind patterns, brush barriers, notes about sediment gathering behind porous structures. One page showed a simple fence line with a shaded drift drawn behind it. Beside the sketch, Earl had recorded the date when spring grass first emerged there. Mara stared at the page for a long time. Then she went to the back door and looked at Daniel's boots. She remembered walking the western boundary with him as a child, sinking nearly to her waist in a snowdrift, trapped behind the old fence, while ground 20 yards away lay exposed. She remembered the same strip turning green before the rest of the pasture. Not because someone had irrigated it, because the fence had made the wind leave the snow there. For the first time in months, Mara felt something other than pressure. Not hope exactly, something narrower. A direction. Commercial snow fencing cost more than she could spend. New livestock panels were impossible at the scale she needed. Then, 2 weeks later, Mara saw the demolition listing. Hundreds of wrought iron gates were being cleared from unfinished housing developments, demolished estates, and a contractor's storage yard. Many were damaged badly enough that nobody wanted them for their original purpose. The contractor wanted them gone. If Mara hauled them herself, she could take the whole lot for little more than scrap value. She drove out the next morning. That was how the first trailer arrived, and the second, and the 12th. The neighbors saw the object. Mara saw what the object could make wind do. She placed roughly 520 gates across the most exposed pasture slopes, arranging them in broken, porous rows rather than solid walls. Air moved through the bars, but not at the same speed. On selected sections, she wove juniper limbs loosely through the iron, enough to disrupt the wind without sealing the structure. The remaining gates went into shallow erosion channels, where she anchored them low and packed brush against portions of the frames. The goal was never to stop water. It was to make water hesitate. A few seconds slower across a patch of earth. A little less force in a wash. A handful of sediment dropped instead of carried away. One small change repeated hundreds of times. By October, the theory had become exhausting reality. The ground fought every post. Mara swung the driver until her shoulders trembled, only to strike buried stone 6 inches down. One afternoon, the tractor's hydraulic hose burst while she was carrying brush toward the north draw. Oil sprayed across the axle. She killed the engine and sat behind the wheel while the last of the hydraulic fluid pattered into the dust beneath her boots. The pasture around her was silent. A broken gate lay on the trailer. 30 yards away, a bare patch of earth shivered in the wind. For several minutes, she did nothing. Then she climbed down, walked back to the barn, found an old hose her father had saved on a shelf, cut away the damaged fitting, and made it work. A week later, the trailer tire blew 26 miles from home. She replaced it beside the highway in a hard crosswind, kneeling in gravel while trucks rocked the trailer as they passed. Then cattle broke through an unfinished section and knocked 6 gates flat. Mara found them at dusk. One gate had twisted around a T-post. Another lay face down in the dirt, its decorative bars bent beneath hoofprints. A third had been dragged halfway into the draw. For a long moment, she stood with the wire cutters in her hand and watched the sun sink behind the ridge. Then she started pulling wire. By the time the final gate stood again, the moon had risen. Those were the failures people saw. The failures they did not see happened at the kitchen table. Hay invoices arrived in November. Mara opened one envelope, read the total, and placed it beneath a salt shaker as though the weight might keep the number from growing. She sold several calves earlier than planned. The check covered feed, fuel, and part of a repair bill, but reduced the income she had counted on for spring. December came with cold and almost no snow. For 3 weeks, the gate stood beneath a pale, empty sky. Mara had spent months placing iron across a ranch that looked exactly as dead as before. One night, after feeding cattle in darkness, she entered the house and found the kitchen cold. The furnace had shut itself off again. She did not restart it. She sat at the table wearing her coat. A bank statement lay beside the old map of the South pasture. She had taken the map out of the glove box that afternoon. For the first time since refusing to sell, Mara unfolded it completely. The yellow boundary ran through the cottonwood draw, across the old fence line, and around the best grass on the ranch. Her eyes stayed on it until the numbers blurred. She reached for the phone. The neighboring rancher's number was already written on a feed receipt beneath the map. Her thumb hovered above the keypad. Outside, wind pressed against the walls. Something metallic struck the barn again and again. One of the gates, probably. Mara lowered the phone. Then she saw her father's boots beside the door. The left boot still carried the dried crescent of mud from his last walk to the south pasture. She crossed the room and picked it up. A fencing staple fell from inside. It must have been caught beneath the tongue for years. The tiny U-shaped piece of steel struck the floor, bounced once, spun in a tight circle, then lay still. Mara stared at it. The kitchen disappeared for a moment. She was 9 again. Snow in her eyelashes. Her father ahead of her at the fence. Daniel's hand reaching backward through the storm. Her own small fingers finding a staple inside the oversized coat pocket and placing it in his palm. He had never turned around. He had simply trusted that it would be there. Mara picked up the staple. The metal was cold against her fingers. She put the phone face down. She folded the map. Before sunrise, she was outside. The first real snowstorm arrived 2 nights later. By morning, 6 inches covered the ranch. Then the wind began. Mara waited until daylight and drove into the pasture. Snow streamed low across the exposed ridge like smoke. In open areas, grass already showed through. She stopped beside the first gate line. Behind the iron, a drift had formed. Mara stepped from the truck and pushed a measuring rod through the surface, nearly to her knee. She walked 20 yards into the open, barely 3 inches. She measured again, then again. At the next row, the same pattern appeared. The gates were catching snow, not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough to make the difference visible in inches. Mara stood in the wind with the measuring rod in one hand. Snow struck her face. For the first time since February, she smiled. Winter kept testing the system. Some rows failed. Mara rebuilt them. One barrier leaned so far after a storm that she reset every post in frozen ground. Another collapsed beneath the weight of a drift. She changed its angle and rebuilt it. With each storm, the pattern sharpened. By February, white bands stretched behind the rusted gates, while neighboring slopes stood brown. From the hill above the house, Cole Ranch looked striped. Then spring arrived dry. March passed with almost no moisture. April followed. Stock ponds dropped early. Dust appeared behind pickups. Feed trucks began making more frequent deliveries around the county. The bank review was approaching. Snowdrifts alone would not save Mara. They had to become grass. The deepest drifts melted slowly. Water darkened the soil behind the gate rows. In the shallow draws, meltwater moved through the brush-packed iron and lost speed. Fine sediment settled. Dead leaves collected. Small shelves of soil formed where runoff had previously cut downward. Every morning, Mara walked the same routes. For days, nothing changed. Then, just after sunrise in the first week of May, she smelled it before she saw it. The wind coming off the north slope was cooler than usual. Under the familiar scent of sage and rust was something darker, richer. Wet soil, roots, the faint mineral smell that rose from earth after water had finally reached it. Mara stopped walking. The high desert rarely smelled like that in May. She followed it downhill. Near the sheltered side of a gate row, a thin streak of green pushed through the brown. Mara stared at it. Then she crossed the last few yards quickly and dropped to one knee. The gate beside her was rough beneath her left palm, its surface flaking rust that caught against old cuts in her skin. Her right hand rested on the ground. The soil was cool. Not dusty, cool. She pressed her fingertips into it, and a dark crescent formed beneath her nails. Between her scarred knuckles stood several blades of new western wheatgrass. Mara touched one carefully. The blade folded against her fingertip, soft, almost weightless. Her hands were covered in calluses from wire, steel posts, hydraulic fittings, and 12 months of work that had seemed foolish to everyone watching. The grass was so young she could have crushed it without meaning to. She held it between 2 fingers anyway, not pulling, just feeling that it was there. Wind passed through the iron bars above her. The smell of damp earth rose again. For several seconds Mara stayed on her knees. Then she laughed once. A small sound, half relief, half disbelief. She wiped her face with the back of one dirty glove and stood. At dawn, Mara found hoofprints pressed deep into soil that had been powder dry only a year earlier. She crouched beside the track and pushed 2 fingers under the grass, feeling cool earth hold firm. The roots beneath it smelled dark and mineral-rich, a scent the warm wind had not carried in years. Above her, a rusted gate clicked softly in the breeze, while green blades trembled around its feet. She rubbed wet soil between thumb and forefinger until the dark grit filled each crack in her skin. For months those hands had lifted iron, tightened wire, patched hoses, and signed checks she feared. Now, her scarred fingers vanished under grass that had been thin enough to count 1 stem at a time. She stayed there until a meadowlark called from the fence and the cattle began going down the hill. The ranch stayed fragile, but for once, its silence felt patient, no longer hollow or near collapse. When Mara stood, rust marked one palm and damp earth marked the other, and she carried both indoors. A few days later, another green line appeared below the first. Then another. Western wheatgrass thickened where snow had lingered. Young bunchgrass emerged around trapped sediment. Mara climbed the ridge above the house later that month, but this time she did not stop simply to look. She already knew what the ground felt like. Below her, the pasture remained mostly brown. Through that brown ran green bands, dozens of them, long strips where snow had lingered. Curving patches along the repaired draws, color following the exact places where rusted iron had slowed wind and water. The transformation was not sudden enough to feel magical. That made it more powerful. Week by week, the green widened. May remained dry. Neighboring pasture faded. Coal Ranch held. Not everywhere, not evenly, but enough. Enough grass to extend grazing. Enough moisture to keep recovering plants alive. Enough sediment caught in shallow washes to stop some of them from deepening. Enough forage to reduce the hay Mara would otherwise have purchased. By June, the change could be seen from County Road 14. Pickup trucks slowed again. This time, some pulled onto the shoulder. Mara was driving back from checking cattle when she saw 3 of them parked along the fence. She recognized the white Dodge from the feed store. Beside it stood the same silver-haired rancher from the diner, the man who had once traced a falling square into the condensation on his water glass. He was looking past the fence at the green strips moving around the rusted gates. Mara approached in the Ford. No one waved her down. No one called out. As she passed, the silver-haired man turned toward her. For 1 second, their eyes met through the open truck window. Then he lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his cowboy hat. Just a touch, barely a gesture at all. Mara did not slow down, but one corner of her mouth moved. In the rearview mirror, the men remained by the fence, looking across the pasture. The laughter was gone. There would be no apology. There did not need to be. The financial recovery came more quietly. Her cattle held better condition through summer. The calves went to sale heavier than the year before, and because the ranch had carried more of its own forage, Feed costs landed below the number Mara had feared all winter. At the bank review, the same manager who had once traced his pen down columns of projected losses now stopped near the bottom of Mara's new statement. He looked at the feed expenses, then the calf weights, then the balance. The operating line remained open. The debt did not vanish. The barn did not repair itself. The old tractor still left a dark spot on cardboard overnight, but the yellow map of the south pasture went back into the glove box, unsigned. Summer settled over Cole Ranch gradually after that. The first green bands hardened into mature grass. Cattle moved through rested sections under wide blue mornings. Thunderheads occasionally built over the mountains, and when short storms finally returned, Mara walked the draws afterward and found water moving differently than it had the year before. Not stopped. Slowed. Behind the brush-packed gates, new sediment accumulated in thin, dark layers. By early fall, the ranch had begun to carry the look of a place recovering rather than merely surviving. That was when a conservation specialist came to see it. He walked the property with Mara, pushing a soil probe behind several gate rows and repeating the test in exposed ground. He inspected the shallow draws where sediment had collected and photographed native grass establishing around the barriers. The gates themselves interested him less than the placement. Wind direction, slope, runoff, spacing, rested grazing areas. Mara had not rescued 480 acres with a single invention. She had made hundreds of small losses happen more slowly. A little less snow blown away. A little less water rushing downhill. A little less soil leaving the ranch. Repeated often enough, those small differences had become visible from the road. By the following winter, old cattle panels began appearing on another ranch 3 miles east. The next spring, someone farther north installed brush fencing along a shallow draw. No one called Cole Ranch a junkyard anymore. Mara never asked anyone to admit they had been wrong. The land had already done it for them. On a cool morning in her second spring, she drove the Ford toward the south pasture. The truck still rattled over the same ruts. The cottonwood still leaned east. At the old fence line, Mara stopped and walked to the post her father had repaired during that March blizzard years earlier. The wire was rusting now. One staple had begun to work loose. Mara took a hammer from the truck. She held the staple between 2 fingers and drove it back into the wood with 3 clean strikes. Then she stood there for a moment, hand resting against the post. Behind her, cattle grazed across grass that had once been written off. Farther uphill, hundreds of abandoned gates crossed the ranch in dark, broken lines. Some were nearly hidden now by bunch grass. Wind slipped through their bars. Nothing stopped it completely. That had never been the point. Inside the farmhouse, Earl Cole's notebook rested beside Mara's on the kitchen table. His pages contained faded observations from another drought. Hers contained snow depths, soil measurements, grazing rotations, rainfall totals, calf weights, and new sketches for the coming winter. Her grandfather had noticed what old fences could do. Her father had kept the land together long enough for that knowledge to reach her. And Mara had taken 800 things nobody wanted and given them one final job. Not holding cattle, not closing roads, not guarding houses, holding opportunity in place long enough for roots to reach it. Late that afternoon, the western wind rose again. It crossed miles of open Wyoming, pushed through sage, swept over bare ridges, and finally reached a rusted gate standing alone above the house. The wind passed between the bars. Rust roughened the iron. On the sheltered side, the earth still held the faint dark scent of moisture beneath the grass. A thick band of high desert green bent low beneath the wind, then lifted again. A year earlier, everyone had been looking at the iron. Mara had been watching what happened on the other side. And that was how a dying ranch began turning green again,